Good evening from New York. What would we now remember of China's Tiananmen Square uprising 20 years ago this month if no one had ever seen the iconic image of the one lone protester halting the advance of a column of tanks? Our fifth story in the countdown, the striking scenes of burgeoning revolution in Iran that the Iranian government does not want you to see. Those images getting out anyway because of what might become, and it is still the longest of long shots, a Twitter revolution. Another day of protest over the presidential election results in that country, this time amid new media restrictions. Videos posted on YouTube of another big rally in Tehran, other reporting done via Facebook and tweets. Supporters here of opposition presidential candidate Musavi demonstrating in overwhelming peace, many marching in relative silence. One eyewitness telling the BBC that he believed there were more people in attendance than at yesterday's protest, which was attended by hundreds of thousands. Today's taking place a few blocks away from another. This one, the government busing in thousands to support President Ahmadinejad. It does not appear to have been on the scale of the opposition demonstration. In a message on his website, Mr. Musavi telling his supporters he would not be attending today's rally, asking them not to be baited into any violence with the rival demonstration. We now know that 7 of Musavi's supporters were killed in yesterday's violence. Another amateur video surfacing on the web that purportedly shows a shooter leaning out of a window in Tehran's Azadi, or Freedom Square, while firing his weapon into the crowd. The protesters had been claiming widespread fraud in Friday's presidential voting. Iran's powerful Guardian Council meeting with representatives of the 3 opposition candidates, telling them it would approve a limited recount in specific areas contested by the losing candidates. Yet what good would such a recount do if the same people who seem to have perpetuated the fraud were to carry out the recount? For example, the opposition claiming that many more ballots were issued than had been counted. Some people in areas loyal to the opposition were not given ballots. Polling stations in other places were closed early, they say. Twitter closing early today at 5 p.m. Eastern for planned but delayed maintenance. The U.S. State Department having actually asked the internet messaging site not to take its communications offline overnight our time last night because of the vital role that Twitter has been playing in getting the word out for the opposition in Iran. It held off its maintenance until Iran's overnight hours. That the only visible sign of interference by the Obama administration. The president today emphasizing that his government is not meddling in the Iranian dispute. In an interview with John Harwood of our sister network CNBC, the president stopping short of saying the election was stolen.
And when you've got 100,000 people who are out on the streets peacefully protesting, and they're having to be scattered through violence and gunshots, what that tells me is the Iranian people are not convinced of the legitimacy of the election.
The president adding that from a U.S. foreign policy perspective, there might not be a huge difference between the leading candidates in that election.
Although there is amazing ferment taking place in Iran, that the difference between Ahmadinejad and Musavi in terms of their actual policies may not be as great as has been advertised. Either way, we were going to be dealing with an Iranian regime that has historically been hostile to the United States, that has caused some problems in the neighborhood, and is pursuing nuclear weapons.
The bigger difference, perhaps, to be found, in fact, between the approach of President Obama and his American opposition. In a Today Show interview, his former rival for the White House calling for a more aggressive American approach.
The president should speak out that this election is flawed, it is wrong, it's a deprivation of the Iranian people of their basic human rights. He should speak out that this is a corrupt, flawed sham of an election. The Iranian people have been deprived of their rights. We support them in their struggle against a repressive, oppressive regime, and they should not be subjected to 4 more years of Ahmadinejad.
But other Republicans, like the ranking Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee, praising Obama for his restraint. Senator Lugar of Indiana calling Obama's approach appropriate and adding, quote, "We are not going to be judges of it from afar." Richard Wolff's analysis of domestic politics in a moment. First, it's a pleasure to be joined here by MSNBC and NBC News Chief Foreign Correspondent Richard Engel. Good to see you, sir.
It's a pleasure to be here.
What does the recount offer from the Guardian Council actually amount to? Do we know?
It's unclear. It gives the government some time, and I think that is what the purpose is, at least in the short term. The government and the Guardian Council want to slow this process down. They want the people off the streets. They don't want to see major clashes. If, however, the recount just maybe finds no irregularities or narrows the margin a bit and there's no real change, then the people could still come out again, and then the recount wouldn't have served very much at all.
We were talking before the newscast started, and you suggested that this had been the result, all of it, on everybody's part, of a series of miscalculations as to how fervent the opposition actually was on the ground in Iran. Is this offer of a recount another miscalculation? Could it just make things worse?
It could make things worse because it could just convince people that there really is no other option. The government seems to have completely been out of touch with how much dissatisfaction there was and how much frustration after the last 4 years of President Ahmadinejad people were feeling in this country. And I was there during the vote, and people were excited. They were dancing in the streets, boys and girls together, and there was a real sense of joy and optimism. And then when they came out to vote, people brought their families. People came dressed in their bridal costumes to come out and vote. And it's not impossible what the government is saying, that 80% of the population took part. And then, after 35 to 40 million hand ballots were cast, just a few hours later, the announcement came. Not only did their candidate, the opposition candidate, Mousavi, not win, but he got crushed, even in his hometown, and people felt frustrated, went to the streets, and then this thing has escalated since then.
What, obviously, a regime in power wants to stay in power. That's an obvious motive if they did, in fact, alter the results of the actual vote. But were there other components to this? Was this all too Western for the ruling power? Was the involvement of the youth vote, was that central to the blowback here?
It certainly was, and a lot of this focuses on the position of the supreme leader. The supreme leader is not an elected official, and who runs the government, and he manages the affairs day to day through the president. And the supreme leader has found a willing ally in President Ahmadinejad and wanted him to continue. That is, so the analysis goes, and didn't want Mousavi to present a real challenge. The supreme leader knows Mousavi very well. When Mousavi was prime minister in the 1980s, Khamenei, the supreme leader, was his president. So they were very close then. So the supreme leader wouldn't have had that much authority and that much moral authority over his old friend, his former colleague, if that relationship were to change. However, in Ahmadinejad, he can do whatever he says, basically.
Ahmadinejad has now left for Russia for this summit. There was some speculation maybe he would not go because the situation was too tense. What do you read from the fact that he decided to go? What does that mean? What is that sort of statement to the Iranian people?
The statement to the Iranian people is everything is normal. The government is pursuing economic interests in pursuit of bettering the daily lives of most Iranian people. And it has completely enraged the demonstrators who feel this is a snub, that he's not even acknowledging their presence on the street, that he's going and shaking hands with world leaders who are, by the way, China and Russia congratulated him on his landslide election. And if you looked at Iranian television tonight, there's barely a mention of these protests, and that is the approach. That the government says, this is a minor problem, we're going to get through this, and we're pursuing business as normal.
As you said, you were there for the vote, and you have considerable expertise in this entire region and in that nation. Do you have any idea how this is going to turn out?
I have no idea how this is going to turn out.
Goodness.
What could happen, I mean, there's several different options. Each one is more or less probable. But it could just go away, which is what the government is hoping, that this movement will just expire. It doesn't seem like that's going to happen. Today, even with this offer of a recount, people still came out, tens of thousands, perhaps several 100,000 on the street. So it doesn't seem to be just fading away. If the supreme leader feels cornered, and if there is a recount that reaffirms Ahmadinejad as president, which could happen, like I said, in the next 10 days or so, that's when the recount should take place, and the people are still out on the street, we could have a serious confrontation where you have a Tiananmen Square-like situation where the government decides enough is enough, we're using full force. And that what happens at that stage is anyone's guess.
Especially with the new component, as we've been seeing, of instantaneous internet communications that are really tough to block. That's an added, that's a wild card here that we haven't seen before.
And the government is putting a lot of restrictions on it. It's very complicated and very difficult to get reception. They've cut the internet, they've cut cell phones, they've blocked satellite transmissions, but there are proxy servers, and there's a generational gap. The old guard doesn't really know how to use Twitter, doesn't really know how to use a lot of these IP addresses and swapping. They were comfortable with blocking satellite television. blocking SNGs, what we use as journalists to transmit pictures. They knew how to do that. This is new technology that took them by surprise.
Our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, great and cogent analysis. Thank you for coming in and doing so.
It's a pleasure.